Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anna Reyes, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Ben Shattuck, presenting his book, Six Walks in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau. He is joined in conversation by Nick Offerman. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues as our spring lineup flourishes, which allows us to present authors and their work to our incredible community, especially on this digital platform. Find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from the comfort of your home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. If you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, in a moment, I'll be posting a link in the chat for Six Walks available on our website. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of this landmark independent bookseller. Thank you all for showing up and tuning in. In support of authors, publishers, and indie bookselling, we sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Ben Shattuck is a multi-talented creative, a former teaching writing fellow and graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He is a resident of the Penn Robert J. Daw Short Story Prize and a 2019 Pushcart Prize. He is the director of the Cuttyhunk Island Writers Residency and a curator of the D.D. Shallock Gallery. His writing can be found in the Harvard Review, The Common, and the Paris Review Daily, Lit Hub, and Kinfolk Magazine. Joining him on our digital stage this evening is Nick Offerman. Although he is someone who doesn't need much of an introduction, Nick is well known as an actor, author, and woodworker. He has penned several New York Times best-selling titles, including Paddle Your Own Canoe, One Man's Fundamentals for Delicious Living. And tonight they gather to discuss Six Walks in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau. This absolute delight of a book is aptly honored by Hernan Diaz, author of In the Distance, who said, "By walking in Thoreau's footsteps, Ben Shattuck ends up following the long trail left by wandering thinkers and writers like Rousseau, Muir, Walzer, Benjamin, and Solnit. Along the way, Six Walks offers a moving meditation on nature and history, and what our precarious place between these two realms may be." And with that, we are so pleased to be celebrating this book tonight. The digital podium is yours, Ben and Nick. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Anna.
Ben,
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks for joining me, Nick.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having the notion to send me this book. It's an absolute dream boat of a book, and Anna's introduction said a lot of the things I would have liked to, so I'll get out of the way, but I'm tickled pink to be here.
Thanks so much. Nick and I are both in the California time zone, so it's really bright where we are and quite sunny. Somebody just told me that there's a blizzard in upstate New York right now. So with that, we'll enter into the forests and beaches and lakes of Henry David Thoreau's world. I'm going to read two short passages. One is 6 minutes long, the other is 7 minutes. The first is on Cape Cod, and the second is on Wachusett Mountain. For anybody who grew up in Massachusetts, we always called it Wachusett Mountain, but it's officially called Mount Wachusett. So I'll just start with some short readings, and then Nick and I can talk right after.
All right, I will take myself out of the visual distraction zone. See you in a little bit.
All right, see you, Nick. Okay, this starts on page 8. When Henry started this walk at age 32 in 1849, he wore a broad-brimmed hat designed with a miniature shelf to hold flowers he found. He dressed in an earthen-toned three-piece suit and always carried his spyglass for birdwatching. His knapsack was rigged with a compartment for his books, one for pressing flowers, his sewing materials, his fishing line, and a handful of fishing hooks. He walked with an umbrella tilted over his shoulder to keep the sand and wind off his neck, and with a special walking stick doubling as a ruler that he used to measure plants. He took a goose quill pen with which he wrote in luxurious horizontal flourishes. His Y's look windblown, the crosses of his T's like distant hills. He packed salt for seasoning, sugar and tea, and a junk of heavy cake with plums. He was a sinewy, exercised country saunterer, handsomely dressed and carrying with him all the items for misadventure like a flowery battleship. Whereas I, standing on the Nauset Dunes and staring out on the open palm of the Atlantic, looked as if I'd just disembarked a red-eye and had a deep misunderstanding of the current season. The cold May morning wind seized my legs, exposed beneath my bathing suit, but I was sweating from the waist up under 2 shirts, a sweater, a rain jacket, and a winter hat. Henry wore special boots that he slathered with paraffin. My running shoes were held together in the front with duct tape. The sand tore away this tape in the first mile before filleting the soles of the shoes halfway off. So I tied the shoes to my backpack, which meant that in the next couple of days, the dozens of miles of sand would need blisters between my toes, on the upper parts of the arch, and weirdly, on the very tops of my big toes. But the worst was the sun. I hadn't packed any sunscreen, and because summer in New England comes like a gunshot after winter, my calves would go from ice white to red by the time I stumbled up to a stranger's house in Wellfleet many hours later. Knocking on a stranger's door and hoping for a place to sleep, because, as it turned out, I'd also forgotten a sleeping bag in my rush to escape my own bed. The beach is a vast morgue, Henry wrote, where some famished dogs may range in packs and crows come daily to glean the pittance which the tide leaves them. You usually come to the seashore to spend the day with the broad wings of sand flanking your sides and the fan of ocean in front of you. Beaches aren't known or loved for hiking because, I soon realized, they offer a monotonous, unchanging landscape. To my left, for miles, 100 feet of red sand and clay peeking into salt-killed rim of bayberry, huckleberry, and the odd scrub pine wherein a song sparrow trilled the famous first notes of Beethoven's Fifth. To my right, the flat sea, profound at first but unremarkable thereafter, and so my eyes fell to the ground, to this, quote, vast morgue, to see what items the ocean had returned to shore that morning. Beaches do have a tang of fate. The smooth stones, the ringed stones, the tired driftwood, the dead loon, crook-necked and constellated in white dots on black feathers, seemed all there for a reason. The Legos, the cow femur, the wooden chair propped upright and facing out to the sea, 3 pennies whose Lincolns had worn to blurry portraits, nickel reduced to the size of and thinness of a dime, a Red Sox hat, a Patriots hat, a fish vertebrae, and the giant bullet shell whose tip had filigreed to metal lacework. Also, this book is illustrated. Here's a picture of that chair that I drew. I walked for an hour before I saw another person, a bird watcher, with his telescope set up in the middle of the beach. We talked dead loons, northern gannets, and which seabirds were migrating through. Even the long pauses of strangers meeting, I was happy for the distraction, as it momentarily halted the conveyor belt of sadness that the dream I had the night before was still moving through me. I'd rather dream of the bizarre ships sent from my subconscious, the ones floating on waves of anxiety and fear, dreams of two-headed snakes, or my teeth going soft, or my house filled with sharp-toothed rodents. I'd rather the puzzles, images to be interpreted, distanced by a measure of analysis and rephrased for the day. What I'd gotten the previous night was different. A real person put material textures of my everyday life, an experience, a memory like. Not a puzzle floating on anything, just a cold dunk in the sea itself. That's why I was clinging now to the birder, thrashing at him with questions about the migratory routes of loons. The birdwatcher, clearly wanting to end the conversation, wished me well, folded up his telescope, and left to find some shorebird he was searching for. I sat in the sand, and to distract myself, took out my journal and wrote synonyms for the wind. Cloud river, weather's yeast, seasons traitor, colonial fuel. It was a word game I assigned to my freshman college students one day years earlier, when I'd finished teaching the lesson plan but still had 15 minutes before the end of the period. Look out the window, I said to them, and write the longest list of synonyms you can find for anything out there. Sitting at my desk 10 minutes later, listening to the students read their lists aloud, I was unexpectedly moved, entranced maybe. This renaming of nature, these many words for an oak tree, or the clouds, or the sky, or the Iowa River, sounded like prayers, like worship. I think everyone in the classroom felt it, because we all entered the silence you feel in a church or a theater. The spell was broken when a boy started his list with worm shit. Dirt, I said. The earth, he said. Hurricane muscle, I wrote. Summer's respite. Crying scapegoat. So that's one section from the first walk, Cape Cod, and if anybody wants to know, I'd be happy to talk about it more, but it was about 20 miles in the sand from the elbow of Cape Cod to the fingertip, and it ends in Provincetown. The next passage I'm going to read is at the highest point in our state, so I was at, obviously one of the lowest, and this is many, many months later. There's two things you need to know. One, I had sort of hopefully taken MDMA on this last walk to try to short circuit some of the transcendental feeling that Thoreau discussed. And two, I had just run into a man named Paul who came to the mountain every day to count hawks. And three, I had seen a hypnotist. So those are three facts that show up if that adds context. This is on top of Wachusett Mountain. I told Paul he'd love Massachusetts, as if he hadn't already lived here. I then told him I had to leave, and wandered off the lookout, paused and turned and waved goodbye to him and to the other bird watcher, and meandered from the summit to the top of the chairlift. The metal chair, a big four-seater, creaked in the wind. I walked up the off-ramp people usually ski down. Sitting on the chair, I watched a porcupine amble from the tree's foot, part the grass with its brambly body, and eat a yellow flower. Quote, "These bristly fellows are very suitable small fruit for such an unkempt wilderness," wrote Henry of the Porcupine. I heard barking, and I turned to see a man pulling a brown and black blotted mutt by a leash. The dog, clearly smelling the porcupine, reared up, but the man, two boys came running down. Behind the man, two boys came running down from the summit and circled in front of the dog. The boys must have been 10 or 11, each holding a stick, their boots and socks and shins mud splattered. "Careful," I called to the man, "there's a porcupine here." "Whoa, whoa," he yelled to the dog, yanking him back. The boys kept running, pounding up the ramp. "Where?" one of the boys asked me. I pointed down the hill. They crept forward and sat on the wooden boards beside the chairlift. The three of us watched the porcupine graze. One of the boys sat with his legs drawn up to his chest, arms hugging his dirty shins. The other sat cross-legged, enraptured. "I've never seen a porcupine," one of the boys said, so quietly he nearly whispered it. The dog let out a long howl. The father dug in his heels into the ground. The boys knew it was bad if the dog got to the porcupine, and were also, I think, interested in the possibility of it, by the fact that something violent and painful might happen at any moment. And so there was this tension: the dog pulling on the leash, the porcupine softly licking up the stem of a flower, easy in its armor. And between those two animals, the boys, wanting perhaps not for the dog to break away from their father, waiting to see what would happen when the dog's face punched the porcupine. The sound of the chair's crooked metal arms squeaking on the metal cable named the tension of the moment, as the train whistle in Millinocket named its solitude so many months earlier. "Let's go," the father yelled to the boys. One boy left immediately, rushing toward his father, who was already pulling the dog down the slope. The other boy stayed by the chairlift for a moment. Again, he said to himself, for whom else could he be talking to? "I've never seen a porcupine." He might think about this evening from time to time in his life, of the porcupine eating flowers, an animal of such rarity that it casts a landscape impossibility, that really anything could walk out of the woods. I imagined him older, maybe 20 years from now, driving home from work, seeing a porcupine on the road. He might stop the car and watch it slowly cross. He might think back to now, to the first time he'd ever seen one, how he'd been sitting on a chairlift over a meadowy ski slope, how he'd been on a walk with his brother and dad and their dog. He might remember me, vaguely, a stranger also looking at the porcupine. The memory might give him the sensation of his childhood floating back to him, unexpectedly now, as my childhood floats back to me whenever I smell skunk cabbage, which grew on the roadside stream bed where my best friend and I used to play. 20 years from now, this boy might tell someone about the porcupine he saw then, and about the first time he saw one when he was a boy. But he might not tell, out of the hesitation that comes with strong memories from early childhood, how they always sound smaller and softer than the personality crafting forms they really are. The boy then stood to run after his father and brother and dog. There's a heart inside that animal, my mind told me, watching the porcupine move down the slope, back to the edge of the forest. Maybe the size of a chestnut, I thought. There's a heart at the center of all animals. Everything is soft underneath. A very suitable small fruit. And after the sunset, I watched the stars. The warm air shook the oak leaves overhead. I'd taken off my shoes and put my legs inside my sleeping bag. The uneven ground is an old bed that I love. The dreams had been visiting me less now, 4 months after Cape Cod, maybe once or twice a week, and then they seemed to not matter much. The stars, the ones between the channel of silhouetted oak canopies, must be a constellation, I thought. Unlike Henry, I didn't know the names of any constellations except the Big Dipper and Orion. I had my phone, though, with its constellation app on it. I first saw the Southern Cross through the earth. Replicated digital stars washed through the screen as I lifted it overhead, and I pointed the phone to the brightest ones. A figure appeared then, drawn by connecting star points. The caption read, "The Swan." What to do with something so fateful that coincidence doesn't seem like a fair word? What to do with a hypnotist's prediction that only under a swan I would feel at home? The star at the heart of the swan is one of the brightest stars in the night sky, I read on the phone's screen. It is exactly 200 times larger than our own sun. Before sleeping on Wachusett Mountain, Henry also looked up at the stars and also found comfort. Quote, "It was a satisfaction to know that they were our fellow travelers still, as high and out of reach as our own destiny. Truly the stars were given for a consolation to man." Henry had walked to Wachusett, sat up on the summit, and looked at the stars as if they were given for consolation 6 months after his brother died. Was he doing the same thing I was doing, walking to husk the dead skin of grief, looking up to feel the comfort of one's own smallness in the world, to displace bulging selfhood under a shadow of such urgent beauty as the night sky, to force loss and confusion microscopic in perspective. So I spread myself on the snowless hill, and I heard in my drug-slippery mind, I've never seen a porcupine. It came like a chant, I've never seen a porcupine. I wondered then if the porcupine was asleep, and what dreams she might be having. And if the boy was asleep, and his family dog, and my own parents, and all the people I'd met earlier in those months, Mary and Dora and Randy and Pat and Wellfleet. What weird worlds they all were inhabiting in their dreams, tortured or hopeful or anxious or in love, but all completely alone. And then I saw it, that a large portion of the world just then was simply held in their imaginations. Billions of animals suspended in hallucinations, in some place between memory and thought. These hours named sleep, this necessary dark territory we enter alone, is a more startling spell than I can describe. Thank you.
Welcome to the void of the Zoom audience.
Wow. All I heard was my daughter scream in another room.
The void is filled with snaps and musingly applied emotional applause.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for those great readings. That I wish we could sit and listen to you read this whole book. To me, it inspires so much. I was so taken with it immediately because it's something that often occurs to me. The simple notion of that has sort of been beaten out of us in modern society to simply walk farther than you're supposed to. You know, there's an allowable distance where it's like, okay, if you live in the right area, it's acceptable to walk a certain distance to the store or to the post office or for recreation. But to do, these walks inspired by those of Thoreau, immediately society would say, "What's the matter with you? What is your damage? What is your malfunction?" And so I'm curious, how did you first have the idea to do this, especially because you launch in an ill-equipped way. Like it seems like you didn't put a lot of thought into the inception based on your footwear and lack of sleeping attire. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, this book, is an overused word, but this book really came about organically. Since graduate school, I've been steadily working on fiction, and it's pleasant surprise, but certainly surprised that a nonfiction memoir-y thing about a walker from 100 and some odd years ago would be my sort of debut work. The book came after the action. So the action was I had the winter before the first walk been carrying a boat across really icy ground. It was the coldest winter in Massachusetts for 100 years. And I slipped and fell and cut off the top of my middle finger, only about a ½ inch or so. But it's still, if anybody's had a hangnail, you can imagine what a hangnail times 5 million feels like when your fingertip is, as a nurse said to me, exploded off. And so I was at home at my parents' house. My parents don't have internet. TV is horrible for anybody who's tried to watch it recently. And I was on painkillers and I couldn't pay attention to any books for long enough. And my dad, for Christmas, that Christmas, had given me Damien Searle's edited journals, Thoreau journals from the 30s, 1830s and 50s. One thing that people don't usually immediately, because Thoreau's, he has a neck beard, he looks old, is he died really young. He was 44 when he died. And so most of his writing is as a 30-something-year-old in Massachusetts, which is what I found myself to be. And his writing, I opened the book randomly and picked a line, and I thought, wow, that's the best line of the book. I just happened to read it. Isn't that convenient? And then I read another line. I thought, wow, that's the best line. And I realized it was just a brick of gold. Like, his journals are extremely beautiful in a different way than his on civil disobedience or his lectures or whatever else. So I was in a lot of pain that winter, and I would just pick a passage from the day that I was, January 23rd, 1852. And I would look up, and I'd be January 23rd, 2000 something. And I found it really therapeutic. So then jump ahead many, many months later, and I had really gotten into Thoreau at that point. And I just read his Cape Cod essay, and was also still struggling with so many things, insomnia, the finger, I had recently had Lyme disease. It was just bad. And I woke up one morning, I just had to truly escape from my own bed. And the idea of having somebody from the past sort of whisper a plan into my ear was really tempting. So that's how it all started. Did all the walks, and because I'm a painter and a writer, my reflex was to take notes. And I looked back and I saw all these notes, and I thought, man, this would make a great essay. So then it was published in the Comment, and then it moved on from there. Yeah.
Well done. And your illustrations are magnificent to the point of the book is so good that it was able to make me despise you for your drawing talent, but then pull me back in to adore and finish the book. So congratulations on that, you son of a bitch.
Yeah. I'm really glad the drawing stayed in there.
Oh, they're fantastic.
Here's, I didn't show this, but this is Wachusett, when I was sleeping on the ski slope. Yeah, it was really, people have always asked, because I still identify primarily as a painter, and people have always asked, is painting or writing ever mix? And they never had until this book, but it was really natural. Thoreau, for any Thoreauvians on this Zoom event will know, was a horrible drawer. And I was really sad to see that. I mean, maybe in some context, he's a scientific, he counted all the stamen, he drew the flowers, but I feel like I wish he was a great illustrator, because I would have loved to see his drawings because of his beautiful sort of perspective of the world.
In that way, one could say that I am more like Thoreau than you. In that way only. I love to count stamen as well.
Yeah. Have you ever had a neck beard?
Sure, I've had. There's no unattractive beard I've not had. So, something I always love doing when hiking or exploring, and it's interesting. It didn't, until I was thinking about having this conversation with you, it didn't occur to me that I could make a connection between this book and a river horse. Do you know William Least Heat Moon, who wrote Blue Highways, which is a great book, where it's a few decades old, but he travels the blue highways on the map because all the old county roads are disappearing, and the personality of America is disappearing into the freeway and into the Olive Garden and Applebee's. How every outpost looks the same no matter where you are in the country. And then his follow-up book, River Horse, is he traces, using two small boats, the route of Lewis and Clark. Which leads me to the question, something that I love to do if I'm hiking or anywhere, away from civilization, the farther the better, is to try to put myself in the mindset of, okay, now let's kick it back 200 years. And let's say I'm discovering this route for the first time what is amazing about coming over this ridge, seeing this aspect,
Mm,
and what sucks? Like what is the bane of my existence if I'm a European exploring this for the first time? How did you how did you feel on these walks with that sensibility, sort of comparing what you're countenancing
mm.
with what Thoreau took in his day?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I mean, so for instance, on the Wachusett, he he Thoreau writes this beautiful, beautiful essay about walking to Wachusett, A Walk to Wachusett it's called, and the sound of crickets and the stars that he describes, and it's just beautiful. He looks out to Mount Monadnock in the distance, and now there's a parking lot on top of the mountain, and there's a pond with what I think are just pet store goldfish in it. And there is a lot of metal and a lot of people and a fire tower. There's a lot there. But I don't think that means it necessarily ruins. I have a new sort of definition of wilderness that we can talk about later if you'd like, but I don't think that ruins one's experience. Uh, when Thoreau was at that same point, looking west, the most interesting thing to him was the all the trees and like the valley of forest that he saw extending into the distance. And he felt really distant. He talks about that, that he was really removed from the village, as he calls it. The most interesting thing to me was the man standing beside me who had moved from the Midwest to for the second half of his life and came to Wachusett Mountain almost inexplicably every day to count birds. I think people, after the Industrial Revolution, after cars, after everything that has pierced the very depths of every part of most of New England wilderness, people have become a part of that. And the one way to really ruin an experience is to try to make that experience something it's not. I think we have to incorporate people into the especially New England wilderness experience. I'll also say this, Thoreau's, so that's to answer your question, there could be, with the wrong attitude, I think, a disappointment in what you come across. Suburbia, the sound of I was walking through the forest and one time I just heard a drone just somewhere overhead in the canopy. There is that possibility to puncture that, but that feeling of solitude. But what are we looking for when we go into the wilderness? Thoreau's wilderness was like, he was a master of scale. It's like this big, it's a butterfly landing on milkweed. It's the gills of a mushroom. It is very small. It is snow in the elbow of a apple tree. It is really beautiful and really small. It's not the American West. And there is a lot of Thoreau's wilderness in New England still. And so I focused on that. And that really helped. But yeah, it is disappointing. I mean, anybody who's hiked to the top of Mount Washington has a small heart attack when they realize there's a cafeteria on the at the top of the mountain. But again, there are ways. One more point. Like years ago, I had done an artist residency in Gates of the Arctic National Park, which is the most remote park in America. It's way north of the Arctic Circle, size of Belgium, a couple thousand people visit there a year. You need to take like 5 planes to get there. We were going through the tundra. I was painting Arctic wildflowers, but I didn't feel any different than I have sometimes camped 5 miles from a highway in New Hampshire. It's still that you can still sort of pull that experience from being alone. I think the worst thing, the most, beyond cars, beyond parking lots, beyond whatever is visually different from your experience and somebody experienced 200 years ago, is a cell phone. I think it doesn't matter if you're in Gates of the Arctic National Park in a small park up in Maine, in the Allagash, wherever, if you can disconnect, I think that's real. If you can disconnect and shed your technology, that makes a difference.
That's a great answer, and it's inspiring to sort of be forgiving of civilization and understand that this is simply the context in which the butterfly is couched. Uh,
Yeah.
you can still love the butterfly even though the semis are barreling down
Yeah.
the freeway behind you. You know, I appreciate that, and it brings to mind a sensibility of like, there was less drone noise when Thoreau took his walk, but there were trade-offs. He probably had a much worse time with mosquitoes than you did because of our wonderful fruits of industry.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like let me jump into a couple of our reader questions real quick because they're starting to pile up. How much, this is from Christine Prentice, how much is Thoreau's writing an inspiration, or is it the locations primarily?
An inspiration for the writing, do you think Christine means?
I think that would be my guess, yeah.
Um, I think the location, well, there's a part in the book that describes one summer I did Civil War reenacting, and so I sort of inhabited the past in a way. Um, and with reenacting, you try to be a part of something bigger than yourself, in costume, in whatever, to feel outside of yourself. With Thoreau, it's not like I was trying to move outside of myself. I was just connecting to a writer, just regardless of when he wrote, that seemed to describe what I was looking at in the clearest and most beautiful terms. Um, he's a profound and poetic writer, the way he describes nature. Um, so I think the location and his writing go hand in hand in this book. He always writes better than I do about anything, that I encountered, and that's really comforting in some way. Um, and I loved, as I said earlier, having that feeling of a person who is so inaccessible by the depths of time leading me to places. Yeah, and there still are some real similarities. The cool thing about writing a book about Thoreau is that his subject matter is right out your window. If you're trying to connect to somebody who was part of a specific cultural, religious moment 2,000 years ago, 500 years ago, you're not going to be able to access it. We are writing about the exact same thing. We are seeing the exact same thing. Sunset from Wachusett Mountain is the same. And that timelessness of nature, in many ways, I think encountering Thoreau's writing was encountering somebody from the future, not from the past necessarily, because there is this like everlasting quality of New England, at least in my experience, New England outdoors nature.
I I think that is a gorgeous answer.
Thanks.
Um, and I'm not going to ask you about your ties to the Illuminati, but I'm interested in your knowledge of future sunsets. Um, here, here's an interesting question from Dale Evans. I felt the sign installed near the cabin site. Now, I'm assuming this is referring to like the Walden site. Uh, I felt the sign installed near the cabin site telling you were at the cabin site, and with a photograph. Uh, sorry, it just disappeared. Somebody's, hang on. Here, I got it back. I felt the sign installed near the cabin site telling you were at the cabin site, and with a photograph of the cabin site along with the pile of rocks next to the pile of rocks was absurd. I considered civil disobedience. What do either of you think of this kind of park planner nonsense?
I think what he's referring to is actually not something in my book, but that Thoreau's Walden cabin is not at the original site. For anybody, is that it is moved, and it's it's a replica cabin with a replica everything, and there's a pile of rocks. I think that's what he's what referring to, maybe. I parks. I have no comment on that. I don't know. Parks deal with a lot, and there's a section about the time I went to Walden for the first time, and I didn't spend much time in the cabin because I was mistaken for a Thoreau reenactor and then sort of chased out pretty quickly. But by my, I walked out because I was embarrassed that this little kid thought I was Thoreau as a reenactor. But I found I think the state of Massachusetts and whoever, I don't know who has jurisdiction over Walden Pond, has done a superb job for however many years in preventing construction around there. Yeah, the pond's still there.
It is. It's a complicated thing, the way that the way park planners need to spoon feed certain things to we bovine Americans, especially who it reminds me of two things. It reminds me of an Edward Abbey quote that I'm not even going to try and paraphrase, but about how when he was contesting roads being put into national park sites in the American West, and he said, something like, somebody can get more enjoyment out of 1 mile of walking on foot or bicycle or horseback than by 100 miles of park in a car.
Right. Yeah.
Something to that effect. And it also brings to mind the first time you and I went on a hike together. I took you on my favorite hike in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, and pretty soon you noticed I was gabbing away about whatever my favorite new candy bar was, and you noticed a tree with an incredible live beehive in the tree that I was so happy because you have those sorts of you have the set of tools of an observer of nature that makes this book so sublime. And what this question makes me think of is my own ignorance, my own sort of modern blinders, that I need a little more help. I need somebody standing there, a trumpet, to say, okay, this is the cabin you came to see.
Yeah.
Please enjoy our selection of ice cream trees. So it's a balance. I definitely agree with Edward Abbey. I've definitely had some profound experiences where I'm made to find my own way or experience my own vision, which is, I think, a lot of what you had dealt with in this book, versus being spoon-fed your quote unquote wilderness experience. But you put it very well. The parks folks have a lot to deal with, a lot of responsibility, and more than anything, I'm usually pretty grateful to them.
Yeah, I think we are, without maybe naming it a lot or not naming it enough, at a crisis of experience. What do we want from the wilderness? As I said, going to a distant place, and as I said in my Katahdin section, firing up FaceTime and talking to your family at home saying you made it to the summit. You might be in a measure of miles far away, but as Thoreau said, you haven't, you still have the village. You haven't And he experienced that in his own way. It's not just a cell phone. Um, but also, I was visiting, my wife and I were visiting my great aunt in southern France, and we went to this castle, and we walked in, and everybody had goggles, 3D goggles on, and it was an experience of they were looking at the actual room. There was a fireplace. It was like they were in Game of Thrones, more like, and they were all just standing looking around, and it was like, I guess it's better. But you could have done this at home. Like nobody's looking at the actual stones or the way the stairs are worn away from 500 years of walking or whatever it is. And I think that happens all the time with nature. I don't think we know how to interact with nature, especially when we're told that it's disappearing at an alarming rate. What do we do?
That I think that's a great example, and when you're lost in a VR experience, it's hard to have an awareness of what what is what is eroding. What needs our physical attention. Although it does sound like it would be cool to be in that castle and like look at the trippy
Yeah.
hog in the fireplace, and then look at the
I'm not criticizing. I think I was jealous they somehow found these, but all experiences are good experiences with old castles.
I don't know how, just like old growth forests, I don't know how we can let them atrophy and not protect them with everything we're worth. Clarice Eng asks or says, you mentioned at the start of this talk that when you first embarked on this project, you were going through some life changes. At the end of the project, how would you describe your life state? And was it transformed by your pilgrimage with Thoreau?
I guess if there's anything as much as a spoiler alert, spoiler alert for a memoir. Yeah, I was in a much more stable place for sure. But what I think is more interesting than, my emotional state of contentedness, is that what I realized by the end is you really you bring your you bring yourself to landscape. That it is the sun sets for millions of people every day, but everybody's going to see it a little differently. I had gone into my first walk in Cape Cod. I had walked that in sort of a state of anxiety and fear, difficulty, doubt, self-loathing, all of it. And then by the end, I returned with Jenny, my wife, and she was pregnant. And I did the same walk. She was supposed to, well, she couldn't walk 3 miles in the sand because, so we stayed in a dune shack that friends of mine that I met on the first walk let us stay in. And I returned to the same location, and I was sitting on the beach, almost in the exact same spot where I had written those list of synonyms for the wind. I was watching gray seals play in the surf, and I felt like I didn't need anything from the landscape anymore. I thought it was just beautiful. It didn't have meaning like it did when I first saw it. I mean, there's a part in the book where I wrote, in all sincerity, I wish I could trade my thoughts for the fir tree, for the thoughts of the fir tree, just wind and sun. And I didn't need anything from the landscape anymore. And I think that means things were better. Yeah.
It definitely reads like that. It reads, among other things, like a journal of healing,
Yeah.
and sort of perhaps a testament that's what a healthy life is from cradle to grave is if we're lucky, it's a journal of healing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why going outside, or as you started off this talk walking distances that you wouldn't usually just plan to walk, and encountering the unexpected. Why it's always why it can be so healing is because nature is never not offering. There is always something coming at you. And there's one of my favorite moments in Thoreau's writing is when he discovers bioluminescent fungus in wood. And it is just like, here's somebody who spent a lot of time outside, and he's like a little giddy boy running back to camp with bioluminescent wood in his hand. And he's so excited to have found something. There's always more coming at you. Yeah.
Speaking of, an anonymous attendee says, I had no idea Thoreau had done drugs. Was it a one and done experience for him?
For Thoreau, I don't know, but I'm going to take this opportunity to read his description of being on drugs. Let's see, where does it start? It's really, again, it's just so beautiful. Okay, here's his description. By taking ether the other day, I was convinced how far asunder a man could be separated from his senses. You expand like a seed in the ground. You exist in your roots like a tree in winter. If you have an inclination to travel, take the ether. You go beyond the farthest star. You exist like a tree, exist in your roots like a tree in winter. It's just so beautiful. He was 34 when he wrote that. I don't know if he did it. I came across one example.
That reminds me of Michael Pollan's recent book, How to Change Your Mind, where he describes the first time he takes mushrooms in his garden.
Yeah.
And sort of coming into that sensibility of feeling his himself, the roots of his consciousness intermingling with the leaves and so forth.
Yeah.
I
maybe one more question.
I think let me hit you with one more. This is also from Anonymous. Ben and Nick, do you think that Instagram is creating ecological damage to our wild places by mass visitation of people promoting themselves more than nature?
Why don't you answer that one first, Nick?
Well, I mean, I don't, I'm familiar with this conundrum. I haven't seen any numbers, I haven't seen any stats of like, people are going to this, this photo opportunity on Half Dome at Yosemite, and this, the streams are this much more polluted, or the stairs are atrophied in this way or other. But I think, I don't know. I think in general, it's hard to say. I wonder if it's if the benefits of getting those people and their revenue to our outdoor spaces, I wonder how that balances against whatever self-promotion they might be doing. It's, I feel like our public lands need all the attention they can get. And so it takes me back to that Edward Abbey thing, where it's like, if we're bringing people to the parks for the wrong reason, is that going to help their mentality in terms of preserving the wilderness? So that I'm going to answer that question with a question.
That's a really even-handed response. I mean, we've all seen those, here in California when the poppies bloom, those beautiful dusky orange poppies. We've seen those stories of people trampling the poppies to take pictures, selfies. I think how Instagram functions in people's interactions with nature is just an extension of how it's functioning on a much larger scale in our society and culture. And I wouldn't single out Instagram and the use of Instagram in Yosemite, or the use of Instagram in Glacier National Park, or whatever. It is a question that I think we all have to consider, how we use Instagram, what it's for. I mean, it's really great. Maybe a lot of people heard about our event, Nick, through Instagram. And it's wonderful for certain things, but there are no limits, or there's no healthy habit building going on. So I think because we have so many roads and so many cars and so many that you can, because you can access, at least visually, every acre of forest through Google Maps, you have to really be intentional about what you want when you go out into the wilderness. And we might not be able to block out the sound of traffic, but you can certainly try to shed your identity in whatever your village is in intentional ways. And one of those might be not taking photos for social media. That's what I would say.
Amen. Amen.
Amen. Yeah.
Um,
Should we? I think we're out of time. It is 4:59 here on the Pacific Ocean.
Thank you, everybody, for your excellent questions.
Yeah, I'm also, thank you for, somebody wrote in, Jeff, I think, wrote that he took ether when he was having his teeth pulled, which is, I do remember that was part of it, but I'd gotten that quote so long ago. Anyway, thanks for these wonderful attendees and their little facts and questions.
Thanks everyone so much. And thank you again to Ben and Nick for this enlightening conversation. Thanks to you, all of you guys, for spending your evening with us. Sorry if we were unable to get to your questions, but thank you so much to all of your engagement. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Mass, keep reading, stay safe, and be well. Have a lovely rest of your week. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.